I pressed my right hand against the side of Madison Hale's wedding gown. The needle in my left hand stopped in midair. Don't wear it. The digital clock on the wall had just changed to 2:03 p.m. The wedding was 87 minutes away. Madison was a billionaire heiress. That afternoon, she stood between 3 floor-to-ceiling mirrors, wrapped in white satin and thousands of crystals. The train spilled across the floor behind her, flashing under the lights like crushed ice. 2 camera operators circled her for close-ups. Her makeup artist stood nearby with a powder brush, and every few seconds someone outside the bridal suite called in another update about the arriving guests. Madison didn't look down at the place beneath my hand. She watched me through the mirror. What did you just say? I said you can't walk out in this gown. Not like this. Adrian Vale rose from the sofa so quickly that the photographer stepped back. Rosa, that's enough. Adrian wore a black tuxedo, without a single wrinkle and a silver Vale bridal house emblem on his lapel. Whenever a camera turned toward him, his shoulders straightened on their own. For the past 10 years, magazines had called him the man who gave fabric a soul. I'd repaired sleeves and rebuilt waistlines on some of the gowns in those magazine spreads. None of us who did that work ever appeared in the pictures. Everyone is ready, Adrian said. 600 guests, a live stream crew, sponsors, and a $12 million partnership. No one is delaying this wedding because you don't like one seam. It's not one seam. I crouched, took hold of the crystal train where it met the dress, and lifted it a few inches. Madison's waist pulled sharply to the right. She frowned. What are you doing? Letting you feel the weight. That train weighed 22 pounds. I'd put it on a scale myself that morning. It hadn't even been part of the original gown. The night before the wedding, one of the sponsors had delivered the crystal-covered train because the live stream needed, in their words, a moment no one had ever seen before. Adrian looked at a few concept images and promised Madison we could attach it. He never checked the structure of the finished dress. The original gown had been balanced properly. Now they wanted all 22 pounds of crystal hanging from one section near the right side of her waist, hidden behind a narrow seam. It might hold while she stood still for photographs. Once she started walking, the weight would keep pulling down. I pointed to the side seam, already stretched pale under the strain. When you reach the altar, all it will take is one turn. It'll split right here. The room went quiet for 2 seconds. Then Adrian laughed. Did you hear that, Madison? Now she knows exactly when you're going to turn. No one else laughed. Maya Chen stood beside my work table with a spool of thread in her hand. She was 24 and had worked under me for 2 years. She kept staring at the same strained seam. She saw it too. Madison raised her arms so the makeup artist could straighten her veil. I'm not removing the train. Then delay the ceremony a few hours, I said. I'll build a wider support belt inside the gown and spread the weight around your waist. Absolutely not. She answered as if I'd made a joke. The live stream time has been sold. My family is here. The guests are here. Our partners are here. You think I'm going to make everyone wait because a seamstress suddenly got scared of her own stitches? There's one other option. Take the train off now and you can walk out on time. That finally made her look down at me. I paid $250,000 for this gown. I'm not wearing half of it because you changed your mind at the last minute. Adrian stepped close and lowered his voice. Finish it. I won't. It only has to survive the entrance and the photographs. She has to walk in it. She has to turn. She has to sit down. That's not your concern. I looked at him. Once a dress is on a person, it is my concern. His smile disappeared. The hotel documentary crew was still recording. The camera moved from me to Adrian. He glanced at the lens before telling his assistant to bring over the sign-off sheet. Sign it. I took the paper. The final line said the gown was complete and approved for delivery. I didn't sign there. Instead, I wrote in the blank space, "Do not walk in this gown. The crystal train will tear the right side seam. The train must be removed, or the gown must be rebuilt with a weight-bearing inner belt." Then I signed my name. Before handing the paper over, I laid it flat on the work table and took a picture with my phone. I'd started doing that a year earlier. Too many alteration notes had a way of disappearing after they left my hands. Madison saw that I hadn't approved the dress and turned away from the mirror. You're paid to finish my gown, not decide whether I'm allowed to wear it. I can finish a gown that's safe to wear. I didn't give you a choice between gowns. She held out a hand toward Adrian. If she's still in this room, the Hale family's deal with Vale ends now. Adrian stopped looking at the seam. He stared at Madison, the corner of his mouth tightening. Then he pulled the employee badge from my blouse. The pin scraped across the fabric. Rosa Morales, he said, you've refused to complete a client's gown and refused a direct order from the creative director. Effective immediately, you're fired. I had worked at Vale for 31 years. I was there when Adrian's father took orders out of a basement room. When Adrian first picked up a pair of shears, I was the one who taught him never to point the blades at another person. Years later, he appeared on magazine covers while I stayed downstairs taking apart sleeves he'd cut wrong. 31 years, and all of it came down to one badge in his hand. Adrian looked at the sign-off sheet. He tore off the section with my warning, crushed it into a ball, and dropped it in the trash. Now leave. Madison pointed toward the door. Leon, one of the hotel security guards, stepped into the suite. He didn't shout or twist my arm. He took hold of my upper arm the way he'd been trained to and motioned for me to walk. I took one step, then stopped. Don't wear it. Madison's expression hardened. Get her out. Leon's grip tightened. At the door, I turned back one last time. Don't let her turn at the altar. As the door started to close, I saw Adrian pick up a thin spool of thread and push it into Maya's hands. It was basting thread. We used it during fittings to hold fabric in place temporarily, then pulled it out after the client removed the dress. It was useful because it broke easily. It was never meant to hold 22 pounds of crystal. Maya fumbled the spool. It rolled halfway across the table. Mr. Vale, use the fastest method and close it. Rosa just said. Rosa doesn't work here anymore. He pointed in my direction. Do you want to leave with her? Maya looked at me. She had student loans, and Vale was her first real job in high-end bridal work. Her lips moved, but the refusal never came out. I didn't tell her to follow me. I only said, don't sign anything for him. The door closed. Leon took me to a service hallway to wait for the hotel manager. My coat, sewing case, and personal belongings were still in the workroom behind the bridal suite. Hotel staff had to inventory everything before giving it back to me. A wall-mounted screen at the end of the hallway carried the wedding live stream. I didn't want to watch. 10 or 15 minutes later, the feed returned to the bridal suite. Madison was fully dressed. The crystal train fanned out behind her while the camera moved slowly from the floor to her face. Adrian stood beside her, telling the host that the train represented strength, permanence, and irreplaceable craftsmanship. No one mentioned my name. Madison looked directly into the camera and made a small turn in front of the mirror. The seam held. Adrian opened his hands toward the camera. Some older seamstresses are afraid of new construction methods, he said. But real innovation has never been driven by fear. Madison smiled. Make sure that stays in the documentary. 2 hotel housekeepers stood near the screen. They hadn't heard what happened inside the suite. All they saw was a beautiful bride and a famous designer talking about innovation. I kept my eyes on the train. Madison had turned on a smooth floor where the train moved with her. Nothing had caught it. The altar was set on thick carpet. Fresh flowers bordered the steps. If those crystals caught for even half a second, all the force would hit that side seam. Your things should be out soon, Leon said. I nodded. Did you hear what Adrian said to Maya? Leon looked at me. My job was to escort you out. I know. He didn't answer again. At 3:30, the live stream switched to the hotel ballroom. 600 guests rose from their seats. When Madison appeared at the far end of the aisle, the train glittered behind her like a white river. She walked slowly, with 2 bridesmaids helping arrange the crystals. Nothing happened for the first 20 steps. My right hand had closed around my left wrist. I always did that when I was waiting to see how fabric would take a load. Madison stepped onto the first stair, dragging the crystals over thick carpet. At the second stair, the right side of the train caught on a cluster of white roses bolted in place along the edge. It held for half a second. Madison didn't notice. She reached her fiancé and turned toward the guests, following the movement the camera crew had rehearsed with her. One crystal dropped. I couldn't hear it through the hallway screen, but I saw the second and third crystals roll after it. Then the right side of Madison's waist dropped. The pale, strained seam split exactly where I'd pointed. The outer skirt tore down the side. The 22-pound crystal train slid off her back and slammed onto the altar steps. Crystals scattered in every direction. A few rolled all the way to the shoes of the guests in the front row. Madison grabbed the skirt with both hands. Her bodice and underskirt still covered her. She wasn't exposed. But the $250,000 gown hung crooked, with one side of the outer skirt in her hand and the other dragging across the floor. The livestream camera swung away. Voices came through the microphones. The host kept asking everyone to remain seated. Then the feed cut to an exterior shot of the hotel. No one in the service hallway said a word. Both housekeepers turned toward me. I let go of my wrist. Leon's radio came alive with overlapping orders and a woman's sharp voice. He pressed a hand to his earpiece and listened. When he looked up, the official expression he'd worn before was gone. The dress split. I saw it. They want you back. I looked at the hotel exterior still filling the screen. Do they want me to fix it or confess to it? Leon's mouth moved, but it took him a moment to answer. Both. He told me Adrian was already claiming I'd loosened the seam on purpose before I left. Madison wanted hotel security to call the police, and she had ordered them to hold my belongings. At the same time, Adrian had tried twice to repair the tear without removing the train. He couldn't do it. The weight kept pulling the opening wider, and no one else on the wedding team knew how to fix it quickly. What about Maya? She's still inside. Mr. Vale is also saying she may have used the wrong thread. I'd been ready to take my sewing case and walk away. Madison could remember pointing at the door, and Adrian could explain his version of innovation to 600 guests. Then Leon said Maya's name. She had put in those last few stitches. Adrian only had to place that spool on the table, and the incident report would end with her name. I didn't like Madison. I didn't owe her anything. But the train was still attached to the dress. One more step could pull the outer skirt down farther. And Maya was still in that room. I'll go back, I said. Leon looked relieved. But tell them no one touches that tear. And one camera stays on while I work. Turning the cameras off is the first thing they want. Then I'm not touching the gown. Leon watched me for 2 seconds, then lifted his radio. The hallway outside the bridal suite was packed when we returned. Leon cleared a path for me. The people who had watched Madison point me toward the door now moved aside as I walked back in. Madison stood in the center of the room with a hotel robe over her shoulders. Both hands clutched the torn outer skirt. Her makeup was still perfect, but her eyes were red. I couldn't tell whether it was anger or humiliation. Adrian was kneeling beside the gown with a needle in his hand. He hadn't made a single stitch. He stood when he saw me. You finally came back. Then he checked his watch. He didn't say please. Madison looked at me. Fix it. I stayed where I was. Where's the camera? Her hands tightened around the skirt. This is my wedding, not your performance. Adrian already told the cameras I damaged the gown. I'm not fixing it behind a closed door so he can walk out and say it again. One camera operator remained in the corner, his camera hanging near his waist. Madison looked at him. Keep it rolling. Only then did I move toward her. Adrian grabbed my arm and pulled me into the adjoining makeup room. A check and a freshly printed statement sat on the table. The check was for $50,000. The statement said that before my termination, I had mishandled the side seam. The failure was the result of my own workmanship and had nothing to do with the design or management of Vale Bridal House. I was returning voluntarily to repair my mistake and would accept internal discipline. Sign it, Adrian said. I'll reverse the termination. You'll be paid for today and the $50,000 is yours. What if I don't? Madison calls the police. Her lawyers come after you for the live stream, the venue, the sponsorships, and the damage to both brands. You know what that number looks like. He leaned closer. And I only have to make 3 phone calls before no luxury bridal house in New York or Los Angeles will hire you again. You're 58, Rosa. Don't spend your last working years pretending you're 25 and fearless. I looked at the check longer than I wanted to. Rent, insurance, groceries. None of them would wait because I'd done the right thing. Adrian had chosen the amount carefully. It was big enough to make pushing that paper away hurt. Will they drop the police report? If you sign. What happens to Maya? His forehead tightened. She's not part of this conversation. Are you going to fire her? We're talking about you. So yes. He said nothing. I placed the check on top of the statement and pushed both papers back. I'll fix the gown. I'm not signing for you. Then you get nothing. I walked back in here with nothing. I returned to the bridal suite. Madison looked at me immediately. Are you finished? Yes. Then start. You have 20 minutes. I crouched beside her and turned the torn edge toward the light. The thin basting thread still hung from the fabric. I pinched one piece between two fingers and pulled gently. It snapped. I laid it in Madison's palm. This is what was holding up your 22-pound train. She stared at the short white thread. Did you use this? No. Adrian spoke from behind me. She could have changed it before she left. She was responsible for the whole gown. I didn't argue with him. I took the regular thread from my sewing case, cut a piece, and handed it to Madison. Pull. She pulled with both hands. The thread pressed into her fingers, but didn't break. I placed the two pieces side by side on a white tablecloth. This one is made to hold the dress together. The other one is used during fittings. It holds fabric in place until the client takes the gown off, and then we remove it. Madison turned to Adrian. You said you could keep the train. I can. Give me some time and I can redesign. You don't have time, I said. If she wants to finish this wedding today, the train comes off now. Madison spun toward me. No. Then the wedding doesn't continue. That train is the centerpiece of the entire partnership. It's also the part that tore your gown open. This gown cost $250,000. And right now, the part pulling it apart is 22 pounds of dead weight. She stared at me. The camera remained in the corner. It wasn't aimed at her face. It was aimed at the two pieces of thread on the table. Rebuilding the gown to carry that train will take hours, I said. You have two choices. Keep the train and don't go back to the altar today. Or let me remove it, attach the outer skirt to the hidden waist belt, and get you walking again in 20 minutes. Adrian stepped in. There's no reason to remove it. I can. I held the needle out to him. Then you do it. He didn't take it. I'm the designer. I know. I put the needle back in my hand. So, let me do the part you can't. Maya lowered her head. Madison didn't smile. Someone outside the room called another time warning. Madison closed her eyes and took a breath. Remove it. Adrian moved forward. Madison, you can't. The sponsor. I said remove it. I asked Maya to spread the train flat. You stay, I told her. Adrian answered immediately. She doesn't need to be here. She put in the last stitches. She stays. Maya's hands pulled back from the train. Rosa, help me support the weight first. She moved to the other side and lifted the crystals with both hands. I used a small seam ripper to cut the attachment stitches one by one. With each stitch, more of the train separated from the dress. It was too heavy for an ordinary garment bag. We folded it into a hotel laundry sack instead. Adrian stood beside the camera without saying a word. I reached into the bottom of my sewing case and took out the wide belt I'd cut that morning. I'd prepared it when I first asked for time to rebuild the gown. It wasn't enough to support the crystal train yet. Once the train was gone, it was more than enough to distribute the weight of the outer skirt. Stand straight, I told Madison. She did. Arms up. She raised them. Sit down. Now stand again. The skirt moved with her without pulling to the right. Maya worked on one side while I worked on the other. I hid the belt beneath the inner layer, and she closed the tear in the outer skirt. No one told us to just throw in a few stitches anymore. Whenever someone called through the door, Madison gave the same answer. Let them finish. A little over 10 minutes later, I tied the last knot. Turn. Madison didn't move. The first break had happened when she turned at the altar. I stepped back. You can do it now. She turned slowly to the right. The outer skirt stayed level. She tried again, a little faster. The side seam held. The camera moved from Madison to our hands. Adrian started toward the lens as if he were ready to explain the repair himself. I placed the broken basting thread in the center of the table. The gown is fixed. Now let's talk about this thread. Adrian stopped. This isn't the time. You didn't say that when you accused me. He glanced at the camera. You managed this gown for 3 months. Any wrong stitch and it comes back to you. I took out my phone and opened the picture I'd taken at 2:07 p.m. The sign-off sheet was visible on the work table. So was my warning, do not walk in this gown. Remove the train or rebuild the support belt. The picture also showed the open section of the side seam before the final stitches went in. I handed the phone to Madison. This was still open when they escorted me out. I didn't put in the basting thread. Adrian pointed at Maya. Then she did. She chose the wrong thread. Maya still had one hand on the gown. Her fingers curled against the fabric. I sewed it, she said quietly. Adrian turned to Madison at once. You heard her. This was an assistant's error. I'll discipline her, and the company will take whatever responsibility is appropriate. He said responsibility while his finger was still pointed at Maya. I stepped beside her. She did put in the last few stitches. But Maya has worked with me for 2 years. She knows which drawer every spool comes from. She didn't choose this one herself. I looked at Maya. Who handed it to you? Adrian cut in. Of course the two of you are going to protect each other. Then let her answer. Maya tried to speak twice. Adrian stared at her. Think carefully. Whether you have a future in this industry depends on what you say next. The camera didn't move. Madison heard him too. Maya reached into her apron pocket, took out the spool, and set it beside the broken thread. He gave it to me. Her voice was still quiet, but she didn't stop this time. After Rosa was taken out, Mr. Vale told me to use this spool. He said the gown only had to survive the pictures and the walk-in. I reminded him that Rosa had written a warning. He asked if I wanted to be fired with her. You're lying, Adrian said. Maya's shoulders shook once. Leon spoke from the doorway. No, she isn't. Everyone turned. His radio still hung from his shoulder. I don't remember every word, Leon said. But when I escorted Ms. Morales out, I heard you tell her to use the fastest method. You said the bride only had to walk a few dozen steps anyway. Adrian looked at him. You're a hotel security guard. You don't know anything about sewing. I don't, Leon said. But I understand English. Madison put the broken thread on the table and turned to Adrian. You knew it might split? I knew Rosa was exaggerating the risk. Then why did you ask her to sign a confession? Adrian's eyes moved from me to the table in the makeup room. Madison followed his gaze. She walked in, picked up the $50,000 check and the statement, and returned after reading the first 2 lines. You gave her this? It was the fastest way to resolve the situation. Your solution was to make the person who warned you confess, then fire the person who followed your order? Adrian didn't answer. Someone outside announced that the wedding had been on hold for 37 minutes. 600 guests were still seated in the ballroom. The live stream remained on an exterior shot, and the wedding team's phones were filling with calls and comments. Adrian finally turned to Madison. What you need right now is to get back to the altar. We call this an ordinary wardrobe failure. Vale pays the damages, the sponsorship stays in place, and no one needs to hear the internal details. Madison held the statement in one hand. And if I do that? The wedding continues. The contract stays intact. Rosa gets her job back and Maya won't be disciplined. Maya looked up when she heard her name. Adrian moved closer to Madison and softened his voice. That $12 million isn't just my contract. It's your wedding film, your brand launch, and your family's next campaign. You don't need to turn your wedding into a public apology over 2 seamstresses. Madison faced the mirror and said nothing for a long time. Without the crystal train, the gown was much simpler than she'd planned. The repaired side seam was nearly invisible. The $50,000 check was still in her hand. One edge had folded under her fingers. Keep the camera running, she said. Adrian went still. Madison, you're right about one thing. This is my wedding. I decide what people see next. She removed the hotel robe and handed it to the makeup artist. Then she looked at me. Rosa, you and Maya are coming back to the altar with me. I didn't agree yet. Maya keeps her job? Yes. And the police? Madison turned to Leon. Withdraw every accusation against Rosa. Return her belongings now. Leon nodded. Only then did I follow her out. By the time we returned to the ballroom, the 600 guests had been waiting almost 40 minutes. The host was ready to restart the music. Madison took the microphone from him instead. She stood where the crystal train had fallen. The staff hadn't picked up all of it. A few crystals were still caught along the edge of the steps. The live stream returned to the ballroom. Before the ceremony, Rosa told me I couldn't safely walk in this gown, Madison said. A low murmur moved through the guests. She told me the train would tear the side seam. I didn't listen. I demanded that the bridal house fire her and had security escort her out. She looked toward me. The gown split in the exact place she showed me. Adrian hurried out from backstage. There's no reason to discuss an internal production issue here. Madison kept the microphone. Where would you prefer we discuss it? In the room where you offered Rosa $50,000 to confess. The camera turned toward Adrian. He raised a hand to block the lens. Madison continued. The Hale family's partnership with Vale ends today. The $12 million contract is cancelled. We'll absorb the cost of breaking it. Rosa Morales and Maya Chin will not be blamed for what happened to this gown. Adrian rushed toward her. You can't destroy an entire brand over one accident. You almost destroyed 2 people to protect it. He turned toward me and reached for the phone and thread in my hands. Leon caught him by the upper arm. It was the same place he'd held me 40 minutes earlier. Adrian jerked away. Let go of me. Do you know who I am? Leon didn't release him. I do. But now someone has asked you to leave. Madison looked at Leon. Take him out. As Adrian passed me, he kept saying I'd destroyed the contract, the wedding, and the Vale name. I didn't argue. I picked up the spool of basting thread and slipped it into the pocket of his tuxedo jacket. Leon escorted him from the ballroom. This time, the door closed behind him. Madison looked down at the silver Vale emblem at her waist. It had been added to match the crystal train and appear in every official photograph. She handed me a small pair of scissors. Please take it off. I cut the 2 stitches holding the emblem and placed it in her palm. There's one more thing, she said. She raised the microphone again. Rosa didn't damage my gown. She stopped it from tearing any farther, and she made it possible for this wedding to continue. Maya followed a bad order because her job was used as a threat. I was the one who forced the bridal house to fire Rosa. She was right. I was wrong. The ballroom didn't erupt in applause. Madison didn't wait for it. She lowered the microphone and asked me, Is the gown safe now? I checked the waist one more time. You can walk. You can sit. You can turn. She nodded. Then let's finish the wedding. The music started again. Madison returned to her fiancé without the crystal train or the silver Vale emblem. The gown was much simpler than the one she'd planned to wear. Before turning at the altar, she looked at me. I nodded. She turned. The seam held. After the wedding, Vale Bridal House called me 7 times. I didn't answer once. The next morning, a representative delivered an offer to reinstate me. The board had removed Adrian as creative director and public face of the company and canceled all of his upcoming appearances. They offered to restore my salary and benefits, put me in charge of the entire workroom, and pay me 3 times what I'd made before. I still went to the meeting. Maya and the other seamstresses were still at Vale, and I wanted to hear what the board planned to do for them. For people sat across from me at the conference table. They kept saying how much the company valued my experience. They were even willing to put my name on the workroom director's office. I asked whether the people who made the gowns could have their names on the labels and on the company website. They said they were willing to discuss giving me individual credit. What about Maya? I asked. What about the other 12 people who cut the patterns, stitched the gowns, and attached every bead? One board member closed the folder in front of him. Rosa, we're offering you an extraordinary opportunity. I know. Then why do you insist on putting everyone else into your agreement? I looked at the metal nameplate on the table. It said Workroom Director. Because you've already tried putting one name on every dress. I pushed the nameplate back. That man wouldn't even pick up the needle. The meeting didn't last much longer. Maya was waiting across the street when I left the building. She asked whether I'd turned them down. I told her I had. What are you going to do now? I didn't have an answer. Then my phone rang. It wasn't Vale. It was a bride who had watched the wedding live stream. She was getting married in 3 months and had already canceled her order with Vale. She said she didn't want the designer who only appeared in photographs. She wanted the seamstress who was willing to say, "You can't wear that." When the call ended, an email came in. Then another. And another. Within 48 hours, Maya and I had received enough serious inquiries to move forward. The first 6 clients paid deposits for us to inspect or make their gowns. I used those deposits to lease a small workroom that had been about to close. It wasn't grand. It had 2 street-facing windows and 6 work tables. Maya joined me the first week. 6 more seamstresses left Vale and came after her. Madison paid the full emergency repair bill from the wedding, including every hour Maya and I spent removing and rebuilding the gown. There was no extra gift. Later, she invited our new shop to bid on the Hale family's gowns for the next season. She told us to set our own terms. I added one sentence at the bottom of our proposal: every gown must name the people who actually designed, cut, and sewed it. Madison signed. A few months later, we finished the first wedding gown in our new workroom. Maya hung it near the front window, where the afternoon light fell across the skirt. "Do you want to check the waist one more time?" she asked. "Turn it again." She moved the dress form in a full circle. The skirt followed without pulling. I turned the gown inside out and found the label we'd just sewn in. Adrian's name wasn't on it. It didn't say something empty like handmade, either. The label read, "Designed and fitted by Rosa Morales. Cut and sewn by Maya Chen and her team." I pressed all 4 corners of the label flat. For 31 years, I'd sewn wedding gowns that carried someone else's name. This one finally knew who made it.